Hello, hello, hello. I hope you all have a fantastic Valentine's Day tomorrow, and I hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Chapter 5 Escape? Ariel heard them coming. Heart pounding, she looked around again. No place to run to, no place to hide. After a blank moment, Derek took the key to Perry Helene out of his pocket. Ariel gasped, put it in her palm, squeezed the four corners in succession, and closed both their hands around it fiercely. Ariel pushed the button as they held their breath. The grey nothingness of Perry Helene was around them, for ever and ever to the limits of vision. Derek let his breath out. "Frost! I thought they had us. So did I!" They were in no hurry to return to Earth, yet there is surely no more boring place in hyperspace or normal space, whichever it was, than perihelion. They looked at each other, and Ariel shrugged as Derek wiped his brow. Oh no! They had moved at the same time, and, releasing each other, had drifted apart. With great presence of mind, Derek lunged for her. Ariel was in shock. Had she reached for him at the same time, she could have caught his hand. Too late. They looked at each other tragically. Inexorably, they drifted further apart. Ariel felt she had to make up for it. "I'll throw you the key," she cried. "You go back to Earth. Forget about me." "Nonsense. If you do, I'll throw it back." At that moment his face went blank, and he contorted himself into a knot. Reaching for his soft shoes, he tore them off. Writhing with a practised free-fall motion, he turned his back to her and hurled the first shoe away. With the reaction to that throw, he ceased to recede. Now he was rotating. He allowed himself to rotate twice, studied her, then writhed again and threw the other shoe. After a prolonged wait they seized each other, Ariel gasping in relief. To her surprise, she felt him shaking. "Derek, you were marvellous. I thought we were lost." Derek grinned shakily. "What you said about throwing the key gave me the idea. Frost, I'm glad something did." Ariel took the key and pressed the corners again, and, with both gripping it, pressed the button. Our David was against the wall in his usual place. "Frost!" Ariel said, feeling ready to collapse. She sat down, knees shaking, and so did Derek. "What did they mean, your little social study of conditions on Earth? The yeast farmers?" Derek asked. Ariel had no idea. They put the question to our David, careful not to let him know that they had been in serious danger. He said, "I have no access to news feed, but I believe that Dr. Avery made some public announcement about studying social conditions on Earth when he first contacted earthly authorities to transfer rare metals for money. He promised not to send in humaniform robots, and of course it did not occur to the authorities that he would enter earthly society himself." "Then how did he expect to make any study of Earth society?" Ariel asked skeptically. "He purchased many earthly studies of the subject, and also me. While ostensibly studying these sources, he quietly developed the medical prophylaxis with which I treated you, and infiltrated Earth society in his own person, learning what kinds of identification and ration media he would need to have to pretend to be an Earthman. Some of those he bought openly as samples for his study. In short, over a period of an earthly year he was occasionally in the news as he came and went from Earth. And from this study he was allegedly making, I suppose that rumors might have gone abroad that teams of spacers are studying Earth sociology on the spot. That is, of course, very unlikely." "Very," said Derek with a grimace. "Spacers are just not interested in the subject, and if they were they wouldn't take the health risk." Ariel could not care less about Earth's rumors. "The important thing is to get back into space," she said. "You're right," Derek said. I'm more than tired of concrete caves and troglodytes that live in them." She smiled fleetingly at the term. "So the third thing is to find out how to get to the spaceport. The first being to have those directions to the nearest personnel repeated, and the second to find a shoe store." Ariel grimaced, but said, "You're right." When put to the question, our David said, "The spaceport is located near New York, Miss Avery." They looked at each other blankly. Of course they knew that there were 800 cities on Earth. There had been thinking in terms of one giant city covering all Earth, the natural extension of their earthly experience. "What city is this, then?" Ariel asked. "The city of St. Louis," said our David. "It is on the same continent as New York." New York, so travel is facilitated. One may take the train, and for the third of the distance of the way is enclosed and roof over. It takes less than 12 hours, half an earthly rotation, Mr. Avery." He had detected the question on Derek's face. Ariel had no idea what a train might be, and wasn't happy about its being enclosed. She visualized something like the expressway. She looked at Derek, who looked equally unhappy. "Do we have the money, the rating or whatever, to go on the train?" Derek asked dubiously. David said, "Your travel vouchers have not been touched, but I believe there is an inadequate amount. As fours you do not rate much, nor do many Earth people often travel between cities." "Even though we are transients?" "You are transients in this sector, but not necessarily in this city." "We'd better visit the personnel first," said Ariel tiredly. "We'll think it over when we get back." David repeated his directions to the personnels, which turned out to be in opposite directions. Rather reluctantly they split up, and Derek left with a backward glance. Ariel walked slowly toward the women's personnel, hoping Derek's stockinged feet would not be too noticeable. Since this was the personnel assigned to her, Ariel found a shower cubby of the same number as the one on her tag, and took a shower. Again, no towels. She saw a woman carrying a little cloth satchel into a similar cubby and presumed it contained a towel, combs, and so on. She wouldn't need one, as short a time as they expected to be on Earth. She had, of course, brought a comb, though she should see about getting a brush. Fortunately, her hair wasn't long. She made her way back to Subsection G, Corridor M, Subcorridor 16, Apartment 21, without difficulty, hardly seeing the crowds of Earthers who swarmed through the passageways. Derek was back before her and full of energy. Despite their brush of the mob, he wanted to go check out the train station. He was careful not to say so in front of David, who might think it dangerous, but she thought he wanted to see if they could devise a method of stowing away. Showing them on the map, David gave them the directions that would take them, by the route they had previously followed, to Old Town, in something called the Gateway Arch Plaza. The station was beneath that. They would pass several shoe stores on the way. Ariel felt distinctly nervous as they threaded their way again through the corridors to the junction that took the down ramp. But no one paid any attention to them. She would have liked to change clothes, but their ship suits were all they had, and they weren't all that conspicuous. It still wasn't rush hour, so they had the freedom of the express platforms, and went straight up to them on the eastbound side. The clerk in the shoe store was a human, a plump youngish woman, older than Ariel. She crooked her mouth in a half-humorous fashion at Derek's socks and said, "Been running the strips, eh?" She produced neat, cheap shoes, expeditiously, checking his ration tag in her machine, accepted the money tag, and waved them away, calling, "Next time be more careful of the edges." Back to the expressway. She heard Derek's breath speed up beside her as Old Town sector came rushing toward them, but they saw none of the yeast farmers from before, less than an hour ago. "I'll walk the rest of the way before I'll ride this thing into Yeast Town," she said, leaning over to shout at Derek. "Yeah," he said weakly. Ariel saw that he was staring up at the high ceiling, which was higher here than in Webster Groves. There was probably nothing overhead but the roof of the city, for here the ways were in a great slash through the building blocks. No matter, he was having a claustrophobic attack. Ariel sympathized. She had had several of them herself. At the moment it was the crowds, not the impressive buildings, that made her own breath come short. Before she could attempt to reassure him, Derek gripped her arm and pointed. "Gateway Arch, Plaza exit." They descended hastily and rode the ramp down under the ways, found a sign pointing north, and followed it to a local way, also plainly marked. Presently they entered the Gateway Arch Plaza. It was enormous. Gaping like rubies, they stepped out of the swarms of chattering Earthers, and frankly stared. The gateway arch itself was smaller, perhaps, than the pillar of dawn on Aurora that commemorated the early pioneers, and surely was less moving than the memorial at the pillar's base, where outstanding men and women of each generation were honored. But at 190 meters tall, the arch was no small monument. Its span was nearly equal to its height, and the roof was another 10 meters above it. It was all matte stainless steel, ancient-looking but in good repair. The room that enclosed the whole mastodonic fabrication was consummate in size, over 200 meters in diameter, its circular walls a cliff of concrete and metal around the arch. This cliff was covered with the balconies of high-rated apartments. Derek walked boldly toward the lower section between the feet of the arch, and Ariel followed, inwardly amused at the awe on the faces of some of the Earthmen. Some showed unmistakable signs of agoraphobia, exposed to this much open space. Below the arch was a museum dating from pre-space flight times, which might have been interesting, but they were looking for a train station. Quickly determined to ask no directions, they wasted half an hour, some of it in looking at exhibits. Ariel was struck by the unfinished look of all the items people used in the pre-industrial age, all made by crude hand methods. Derek pointed out a plaque that stated that, in the old days, citizens had ridden a sort of tramway up inside the arch. Agoraphobia, he said, echoing her thought. Ariel nodded, and then had led him briskly out the museum. It felt like underground to her, and the crowds of Earthers swarming around were bringing on another claustrophobic attack. She felt much more sympathetic to them, and less inclined to sneer at earthly phobias. They had to leave the plaza itself to find the route to the station. They had been following the plaza signs and hadn't noticed the station signs when they left the local way. The station was a level or two deeper, and a different route took them there. There were fewer people here, but below the passenger level they found a series of freightways criss-crossing the city, which carried heavy items in bulk containers. Many men in rough clothing rode these ways in handling carts, shunting the big containers off the belts at their destinations. These freightways all traveled at a walking pace, no more. At the station they also found the terminus of a tube system for small capsules. Letters and small items, parcel post, could be blown about the city very rapidly by this system, and Derek became quite excited by it. He had seen a system like this before, on a somewhat different scale. The Robot City robots had generated a tremendous vacuum as a side effect of their key manufacturing facility, and Derek and Ariel had ridden the vacuum tubes more than once when they were in a hurry. But here on Earth they were using the same technology, not because they had a vacuum they could use, they had to create a vacuum to make it work. In one form or another, Derek knew, vacuum tubes like these had been used since the early industrial age, and Earth had apparently never discarded their use, because on Earth they made sense. Much more efficient than sending a car for Robot, he said. It is if your houses are close together, Ariel thought. On the spacer worlds they were scattered. The station seemed to deal mostly in interurban freight, but there was a window for passenger traffic. They avoided it and prowled along the cars. The train was no moving beltway, as Ariel had expected. Derek was clearly disappointed. He'd expected something like the expressway. These were cars with ridiculously tiny wheels, and after a while Derek decided they used magnetic levitation under speed. It was a very old technique. Now I see what R. David meant by saying that the way is largely roofed over. 12 hours on one of those, eh? Derek said bleakly. The cars had no windows. Hey you kids! They turned, concealing their apprehension. A rough-looking stranger approached, wearing blue canvas and a peak cap with stripes of pale gray and darker blue-gray, very distinctive. Continental Railroad, said the emblem on his chest. What are you doing here? Looking at the train, sir, said Derek after a moment, trying to mimic the Earth dialect. The other did not notice that. He closed in and examined them sharply. A beefy individual, taller than either of them, and looked as if he worked out every day. Why? He asked irritably. School assignment, sir, said Ariel, thinking quickly. He looked at her sharply again in her tight ship's suit, and she realized with a despairing feeling that she no longer had the figure of a schoolgirl. But he nodded, more in appreciation of her than in agreement, and said more reasonably, "A study of the continental system, eh? We're not to learn much by prowling the yards. Read your books. But I can show you the marshalling yard and the loading docks. You should have brought visual recorders." Evidently their new acquaintance, Peter or Dieter Schallen, had little to do at the moment, and was bored. Taking them briskly back the way they had come, he showed them where the carts were pulled aside, their doors opened, and men in handling machines carried forth containers of assorted cargo. "That lot is bulk cargo mostly, wheat from Kansas and points north," Scollin shouted over the constant rumble of wheels and the whine of electric motors. "Now, over there you see those big blue cars? That's pigs of metal from the sea water refineries in the Gulf, down south way. You'll see some manufactured goods going out and quite a bit coming in. St. Louis mostly exports foods, especially gourmet items. Not a big manufacturing city like Detroit." What Ariel saw was that each of these big cars was crammed full of containers cunningly stacked to fill every corner, leaving no wasted space for even a rat to hide in. "Come this way," said Scanlon, as he pulled them on a tiny truck like a motorized platform. Its control was purely manual, and Ariel fought down fear as she joined the men on it. Scanlon sent them hurtling around the fringes of activity to dive into a bright tunnel, which branched again, and minutes later and 2 kilometers away, he braked to a halt at a balcony. They looked down on the marshalling yards. "Trains are made up here," he shouted. It was noisy here too. Ariel looked and realized why they were called trains. Each was a long series of units, like link sausages. The cars were the units. They were being driven individually along the floor to the marked rails or roads, painted on the floor, to the trains they were to make up. Each train was made up in a specific order. "Over there, to your left, passenger train for the West Coast. 3 cars in blue, with silver and gold trim." They were crawling slowly on its wheels toward, she supposed, the ticket window in the embarking ramp. Once in the tunnels, the cars would be lifted off their wheels by the magnetic rails. On their right was a train of 100 cars, in various colors according to what cargo they carried. It seemed to be the ratio of passengers to freight, except there were more freight cars than passenger trains. "Computer controlled!" shouted Scanlon. "There's a driver in each car for safety, but the computer does most of the placing. It knows where each car goes in the train. They pick up new cars at each stop on the front end, and drop off cars from the tail. The computer also knows which container is in each car and what's in each container. Down here!" Scanlon started the vehicle up again, whirled them down and down, breaking in a flood of light. Black water lapped ahead of them, boats bobbing on it under the low ceiling. "The Mississippi," he said, hissing like a snake. "Transshipment docks." They'd seen enough, but they had to submit to another half-hour of education on a subject they could not, now, care less about. They weren't going to be using the train. Thus ends this chapter. I hope you join for next time on Tuesday. Bye!